The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
President Obama has repeatedly declared that there will not be boots on the ground, there will not be combat troops in the Middle East, including in Iraq, to fight ISIS. And this is a claim that we've questioned quite a bit, and with good reason. In one part, because of the fact that we feel that the semantic games that are being played lend themselves to, effectively speaking, having boots on the ground, having combat troops, and still having a way to not call them that, right? And this could be because they are called security forces, peacekeeping forces that get kind of pulled into what may be combat. And there are many different ways in which that could happen. But also, we've talked about the fact that these things can just change very, very quickly. And we now have pretty significant evidence of that. A Senate hearing yesterday with top military officials revealed that President Obama's repeated pronouncement that there will be no troops on the ground is on pretty shaky ground. There is now no question that ground troops are under active consideration, even at the highest levels of government. General Martin Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said in his opening remarks, he is not ruling out asking President Obama for ground troops. Quote, "To be clear, if we reach the point where I believe our advisors should accompany Iraqi troops on attacks against specific ISIL targets, I will recommend that to the president." Dempsey also testified that the president asked him, quote, to come back to him on a case-by-case basis on the subject of ground troops. Currently, we are up to about 1,600 U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq, serving in what are being called advisory roles. Dempsey reiterated several times during this hearing that he could imagine scenarios in which he would want some or all or most or many of those 1,600 ground troops to switch into what are being called more active roles, though his rationale for doing so changed throughout the hearing. Dempsey first said, in response to a question from Senator Carl Levin, if there are threats to the United States, then of course I would go back to the president and make a recommendation that may include the use of U.S. military ground forces. This nebulous and kind of amorphous term, threats to the U.S., is really one that is pretty dangerous. Remember, part of the justification for the Iraq War was that it was a direct threat to the U.S. for Saddam Hussein to be butchering his own people, which was, of course, horrible, that it was a direct threat to the U.S. for Saddam Hussein to have the weapons of mass destruction that he ultimately did not have, but was claimed to have. I am very, very worried about this, and it seems one of the scariest parts of it is that we're really seeing the lack of discretion and power that in many cases the president has. Even though President Obama ran on a completely different platform when it came to war, when it came specifically to Iraq, than George W. Bush, and his positions were completely different, when it comes down to it, President Obama ultimately does not have the power as president to prevent being drawn back into this kind of ground incursion situation if it is ultimately what the military officials ask for. And it's truly disheartening, but at the same time, maybe this is a good lesson for a lot of people, because on many issues, the significant differences that we observe between President Obama and George W. Bush are important differences, are differences that become tangible. But on some issues, we have such an infrastructure, a plutocratic, mainstream sort of down the middle, lack of discretion infrastructure, that the president does not have much of a choice on some issues. And we're truly seeing that here with President Obama. Talking about Benghazi, just before the House Select Committee on Benghazi's first open hearing, the panel's Democrats decided to put together a website and publish a website that addresses some of those recurring conspiratorial Republican questions about the September 11th, 2012 attack on Benghazi. These questions are going to be featured on a website, which is going to go live just before the committee holds its first hearing. I'm going to give you some of the questions that are going to be addressed. And remember, these are questions that have time and time again in the media, particularly corporate and right-wing media, in numerous hearings that we have already had, in committees, These questions have already been asked and answered, yet Democrats have decided to answer them again on this website. Question: did Secretary Hillary Clinton authorize cables that reduced State Department security? Why was security in Benghazi inadequate despite repeated requests? Why was the U.S. the last flag flying in Benghazi? Did the Pentagon fail to deploy military assets that could have saved lives on the night of the attacks? Did the Pentagon fail to deploy F-16s that would have saved lives? Did the Pentagon order 4 military personnel in Tripoli to, quote, stand down? Did CIA Deputy Director Morell alter the talking points for political reasons? Did Ambassador Rice intentionally misrepresent facts on Sunday talk shows after the attacks? What is the origin of the idea that the video motivated the attacks? Where was the president, and what did he do on the night of the attacks? Are Democrats playing into the conspiracy theorists? Are they placating the conspiracy theorists and those who are obsessed with Benghazi by putting together this website? That's certainly a possibility. Another possibility is that if the Democrats don't put together this website, they are accused of somehow hiding something or not wanting to answer questions. But honestly, at this point, Democrats are going to be accused of that no matter what. They've already been accused of that. I believe that putting together this website was a mistake, because all you're doing is essentially implicitly admitting that these questions haven't been answered. And even if you say, we've put together this website in spite of the fact that these questions have been answered, even if you say that, the message of the website speaks for itself. And I am completely unequivocal in that this is a mistake to put together this website. I don't think this should be done. This should have been done. And you still see people asking about, for example, the video video that was offensive to Muslims as a catalyst for what happened in Benghazi. We already have determined that it was one of many catalysts for what happened in Benghazi, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Presenting facts does not matter to these people. They insist on asking the same questions. They insist on stating that the answers that have been provided are not adequate, and putting together this website is going to do nothing. Incredible video out of Ukraine, where one of Kiev's prominent politicians, Vitaly Zhuravsky, once a member of former President Viktor Yanukovich's Party of the Regions, now a member of the Economic Development Party, came face to face with an angry mob outside of Ukraine's parliament, and the mob stuck him in the trash. I have insane video to play for you. This incident took place before a set of controversial votes. The first vote, this is just amazing what's going on in Ukraine. The first vote granted greater autonomy to 2 breakaway regions in East Ukraine, which have become pretty intense fighting areas because of Russian-backed rebels. Fighters who have not committed war crimes were also granted amnesty. So they were fighters, but they did not commit what have been designated as war crimes. They were committed amnesty. And this was certainly a move that was a concession to Russia. So when Vitaly Zhuravsky comes out of these votes, an angry mob picks him up and puts him in a trash dumpster. Check this out.
На работе на работе. Да на похуюте! А мы живем в этой стране, мразь! Сука, кровь леса, блядь! Из-за вас, пидорасы, наши, блядь, братья! Слава Украине! Героям слава! Охраните, короче, туда же! Сейчас лепись! Давай на лес!
Also, someone in the video threw a car tire in the garbage. You definitely should not do that. That's really bad for the environment. But can you imagine if Mitch McConnell were to be put in the trash in the United States? Can you imagine if when we hear from one of these insane right-wing politicians and they make their crazy declarations, they're just stuck in the trash? I mean, I can't tell if this is what we need in the United States or just absolutely shameful behavior that's a complete departure from democracy and civilization. And a friend of mine who is originally from Ukraine, now lives in the US, I asked him, what do you think about this guy being stuck in the trash? And he said, good for them. He's a corrupt scumbag. I wish they would force 90% of the government out and elect new, younger, more educated replacements. So my buddy having absolutely no problem with this whatsoever. And it is truly disheartening what is happening in Ukraine. In eastern Ukraine, we now have, I'll call it a ceasefire. I guess the right thing to call it would be a very tenuous ceasefire. And we have people who are trying to fix the roofs on their houses, turn the street lights back on. And it is just such a tenuous situation that is hanging by a thread there that I can understand the anger. I can understand wanting to put your politicians in the trash. Ukraine is actually doing that, which is pretty remarkable. NASA has been teasing big news when it comes to space exploration. And yesterday at 4 p.m., they held a press conference. And if you were waiting for an announcement that life on another planet had been found, if you were waiting for an announcement that we figured out a way to travel to distant galaxies, that was not the announcement. But the announcement was still very, very interesting. And the announcement is that both Boeing and SpaceX have been awarded contracts to become NASA's space taxis, and they will be shuttling astronauts to and from the International Space Station. Each company has been granted a contract. Remember that NASA ended the space shuttle program back in 2011 after they decided to review and kind of shift their priorities to exploring deep space, including potentially sending humans to Mars. But now they still need a way to get astronauts to that space station. And more recently, NASA astronauts have been hitching a ride on the Russian Soyuz spacecraft at a cost of $70 million per seat, according to a NASA spokesperson. These new contracts are worth almost $7 billion. Boeing's share is $4.2 billion. SpaceX is $2.6 billion. Of course, both companies' crafts will be extensively safety tested by NASA. I find this very, very interesting. You know, I think that it is truly one of the best investments we can make right now to be investing in space travel. And it is not just because I think that we may find out very interesting things that we will push science forward in a significant way. It is not only because these contracts, this exploration is significant economic stimulus, but it's really because when I step back and I think, if we work together as humans to explore the distant reaches of the universe, and really right now we don't have the capability to explore the distant reaches. It would be, really speaking, only the close reaches. Aren't we going to realize that a lot of the petty discussions and arguments that we have amongst ourselves within the United States, amongst ourselves in terms of between countries, that they are really moot and irrelevant when we think about the grandeur and vastness of space? Maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe it will only lead to wars over who owns what in outer space, and that would truly be sad. But I have, I'm pretty skeptical, as people who watch this show know, I'm pretty skeptical and cynical when it comes to the future in many ways, just because of what we've seen happen over the last several thousand years on our planet. But for some reason, I still maintain this optimism that if we can really work together and see that we are just this tiny piece of an incredibly vast universe, I like to think that it would further human cooperation that would go beyond race, religion, imaginary lines separating so-called countries, which are, of course, complete human constructions. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I like to think that that would be the case. Follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman, and give us a like on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show. We have a fantastic program planned for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is supported in part by liberalbias.com. Liberalbias.com is your best source for unbiased news because in spite of cable news telling us that there's a huge controversy over climate change, 99% of biased scientists keep saying there isn't. If that sounds unbiased to you, liberalbias.com is the website for you. Today's new member of the day is Peter Cassidy. Peter, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. It is because of members like Peter Cassidy that we have the bonus show, that we have 5 shows a week, that we even still exist. So please, if you like what we do, if you want to support the work we're doing, go to davidpakman.com/membership. It is Wednesday, and it is time for Hatriot Mail.
Because it's God's divine plan that every child be born, but an act of patriotic duty to snuff that bastard if he sets a foot near your stuff. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
All right, this week's Hatriot Mail is short and sweet, okay? I can't really understand it very well. It's quite short, but it certainly packs a punch. I will play it. Let's see if together we can figure out what this is all about.
David Pakman is a liberal pansy dopester. The douchebag is obsessed with homo rights and hating the Republican Party.
See, it's short. You know, I don't really know what to make of this one. I think the funniest part of this one is liberal pansy dopester. Liberal pansy dopester. Something about that. I find, even though I know that this is a God-fearing Hatriot, I still think that something about liberal pansy dopester comes off as somewhat endearing or funny. It seems kind of like a harmless insult in some way. Liberal pansy dopester. As far as obsession with, quote, homo rights and hating the Republican Party, I don't know if you've ever actually paid attention to this program, if that's what you think the focus of this program is. Bryan Fischer may have come up with the weakest explanation, the weakest defense, the weakest apologia for the U.S. being a Christian nation that maybe we've ever heard from him. On his radio program, Focal Point, American Family Association Radio, Bryan Fischer brought up a 3-year-old incident in which an employee at a halal-friendly KFC, halal is like kosher but for Muslims, at a halal-friendly KFC in Australia was suspended for abusing a customer who asked for bacon. And he cited that, which happened in Australia, as concrete proof that America is a Christian nation. Why? Because bacon is sold in the United States. Here is Bryan Fischer.
And you know, you want one single item of proof that America is a Christian nation and not a Jewish nation and not an Islamic nation? One single bit of proof is all you need. We freely allow restaurants and grocery stores to sell and to serve bacon. That can only happen in a Christian country. You can't do that in Israel. I've been to Israel. You go into the hotel to eat dinner, go into a restaurant, you can't get bacon there in it. You're not going to get it. Why? Because it is a Jewish country. You go to a Muslim country, you are not going to get pork. You're not going to get bacon. You're not going to get a ham sandwich anywhere. Why? Because it is a Muslim land. So the sheer fact that we freely allow the sale and consumption of bacon is absolute proof that we are, in fact, a Christian nation.
First of all, you can do that in Israel. There's a Jewish pig farm on a kibbutz called Kibbutz Lahav. It's the Kibbutz Lahav pig farm. You actually can. I mean, anecdotally, there is the raising of pigs in Israel, but that is not really the issue here. We actually, let's think of a counterexample to see if this is a good, valid, rigorous assessment of the U.S. being a Christian nation. Shrimp is sold in the United States, which you aren't supposed to eat according to the Bible. That apparently is not disproving that the U.S. is a Christian nation in Bryan Fischer's eyes. Third, we don't stone women when they can't prove or choose not to prove their virginity on their wedding day, which you're supposed to do according to the Bible. Is that proof that we are actually not a Christian nation? Now, there is one other interpretation of bacon being sold in the U.S., in spite of the fact that not all religions eat bacon, which is maybe the U.S. is just a secular nation with separation between church and state. Thus, there is no imposition of religious nutritional doctrine on the broader restaurant and nutritional and supermarket community. And that is why we are allowed to have bacon in spite of the fact that not every religion eats bacon. And then as I was thinking of this, I realized, wait a second, a lot of atheists eat bacon. Wait a second, a lot of agnostics eat bacon. Maybe the fact that bacon is sold in the U.S. is proof that this is an atheist nation. Somehow I don't know that Bryan Fischer would buy into that same logic. And then I thought, wait a second, in China, there's all sorts of pork products. That must mean that China is a Christian nation, right? Oh wait, no, it's not a Christian nation. I wonder whether Bryan Fischer has completely lost it, or whether he ever had it. Do you want us to have Bryan Fischer back on the show? It's been a little while since I interviewed him. Some of his interviews have been pretty classic, like the one where he talked about the rectal wall being 1 cell thick. If you're interested in having Bryan Fischer back on, let me know. Last week, a story broke about a 14-year-old from Pennsylvania who thought it would be funny to take pictures with a local Jesus statue and making it seem as though he were receiving oral sex from the statue, okay? He's currently facing 2 years in prison for this supposed desecration, a charge which, of course, is completely out of proportion and disconnected to what he did. It's not about whether you condone or don't condone taking a picture where it looks as though Jesus is performing oral sex on you. It could be bad taste, it could be immaturity, who knows what it is, but that does not make it a crime. And the story gets even crazier when you consider these two facts that have recently been released. Number one, the kid would have been better off simply vandalizing the statue. As a result of an insane desecration law in Pennsylvania, the boy actually faces a stiffer penalty. Stiffer, I didn't even mean to use that term necessarily. A harsher penalty for gesturing near the statue than he would have for stealing the statue or damaging or destroying the statue. And second, Bedford County District Attorney Bill Higgins is the one who's trying to enforce the charges here. He isn't exactly an angel himself. He posted to his Twitter account audio from porn movies recently. You could argue that that's not really what a district attorney should be doing. And he also had a sexual encounter with a woman in his office, and this sexual encounter initially was presumed to be consensual. Later, the woman actually said she was assaulted by District Attorney Higgins, filed charges. Later, those charges were ultimately dropped. So number one, we have the obvious inherent hypocrisy of those who are offended by a simulated oral sex picture with a Jesus statue persecuting the individual when they have done all sorts of stuff which could be just as offensive or even more offensive to others. And number two, we have a situation where just because something is offensive and it touches a religious nerve, that does not mean that it is a crime. If Jesus were real and alive today and he saw this controversy over the statue and he saw the pictures, actually, if he saw the pictures, he would probably say, that statue looks nothing like what I actually looked like. But that's, I guess, a completely different issue when it comes to Jesus. We'll follow this. I really hope that this kid is not given potentially 2 years in a correctional facility. It would just be completely and utterly insane. Next, we will talk to Tim Wise. You know that thing where people say, no, I'm not racist. I have plenty of black friends. It turns out, factually speaking, it's usually not even true. I'll explain after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We're joined once again today by Tim Wise, who is an anti-racist educator and author of 6 books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Tim, there's this new study from the Public Religion Research Institute, which found that in spite of always hearing about that phrase, which has become almost a joke, I'm not racist, I have black friends, that in fact, for a lot of Americans, it's not actually the case. And the study shows that for every 91 white friends that the average white American has, they have one black friend, one Asian friend, one Latino friend, one mixed race friend, and 3 friends of unknown race, which is interesting. We could even look into that, but we're going to skip over that for now. And this also exists for African Americans and for other groups, albeit to a slightly lesser extent. So while African Americans have about 10 times as many African American friends as white friends, white Americans have about 91 times as many white friends as black friends. So first, let's take this from the broadest perspective. To what could we attribute this disproportionality?
Well, there are a lot of ways to look at it. I think the most obvious is that the level of residential segregation, both historical and also contemporary, is going to result in people living in communities and around folks who are mostly like themselves. However, for people of color, if you're black or brown in this country, you sort of have to interact with white folks. You're going to run into white folks. We're pretty hard to avoid. We're like Visa. We're everywhere you want to be, right? And so people of color, whether they're coming out in the employment world or in colleges or wherever it is, are going to have to interact with us. So they're more likely to be able statistically to develop at least a few friendships with white folks, whereas white folks really have had historically, and I would say still today, the luxury, if we choose, to construct these lives that are essentially racially isolated. White folks, according to all the research, are more racially isolated than people of color. For every white folks on average, there was a study several years ago, found that only about 3% of the people that white folks come across in a given day are African American, whereas over 50% of the people that black folks come in contact with are white, even if they live in mostly black neighborhoods, because they come out of those neighborhoods for work, et cetera. So I think the history of segregation probably has the most to do with it, where we live, where we don't live, both because of historic patterns and also ongoing discrimination. And
last time you were on, we talked a little bit about kind of the subtle nature of what is described as white privilege, which isn't white people have to get down on their knees and apologize to black people. But one of the examples we talked about was, if you're white, you never, in the US for the most part, you never have to say, oh, if I show up at this place, am I going to be the only person who looks like me, or will there be others? And I think that the study really helps to illustrate that, which is a really subtle point to some people.
Right. Well, I think, for most white folks, we really don't have to think about that. Not only because the housing opportunities have been greater, we really have been able to move pretty much wherever our checkbook would allow us to move. On the other hand, we know from the research that for black folks, for Latinos, for people of color generally, even when they have the money to move into neighborhoods that might be more affluent, better resourced schools, more job opportunities, that they are often steered away from those neighborhoods by real estate agents, or discriminated against in lending. So there was a study several years ago which found, for instance, that if where black people lived was solely a function of what they could afford, only about 1 or 2% of the black community would live in mostly black neighborhoods. They would be much more diffuse, much more dispersed, but because residential location is not solely a function of what you can afford when you're a person of color, because discrimination still comes into play, we end up with this significant isolation that people of color have to think about when they're looking for where they might want to live, whereas white folks really don't have to think about that.
Moving to New York City from Massachusetts for me has been a pretty interesting experience, because as someone who on paper is a Hispanic immigrant from Argentina to the US, I am designated in one way. The reality, of course, is that I moved early enough to not speak English with an accent, and I'm the descendant of Eastern European Jews. So for all practical purposes, racially, I'm white in this country. Right. And moving to New York City, the total lack of diversity of Massachusetts was immediately evident, where in Massachusetts you have a Hispanic and African American population, which is quite small and is pretty segregated in South Boston and Springfield, Massachusetts. Here in New York City, as someone who takes the subway every day, instantly your exposure to all different types of people grows exponentially. And right. The relationships that existed in Massachusetts, I haven't yet put my fingers and my head around exactly how qualitatively it's different, but the interracial relationships that I observed in Massachusetts were drastically different than those that I observed here in New York, and I'm not exactly sure why or how.
Well, I think there are two things, right? Number one, let's not overstate just how sort of ecumenical and integrated a place like New York is, because the reality is, in terms of neighborhood by neighborhood analysis,
certainly
New York is one of the most segregated cities on the face of the earth, certainly in this country. So that, yeah, on the island of Manhattan and throughout Brooklyn and Queens, you've got a lot of interaction, maybe less so in the Bronx now, but still, where people live, very much a function of race and socioeconomics and the interaction of that. So people run into one another. But I think even in a place like New York, unless you're prepared, particularly as someone who's classified as white, to sort of go out of the confines and the boundaries of those experiences that are normal or comfortable for you, that it can still be really tough to make close friends of another race, culture, or ethnicity in a place like that. And then the second point I would make, I'm from the South. I've lived in the South all my life. And there's sort of an old saying that I'm not sure really where it comes from, but the saying was that in the South, white folks didn't really care how close black people got. They just didn't want them to get too high. And in the North, white folks didn't care how high black folks got. They just didn't want them to be too close. In other words, in the South, we had an intimacy and a familiarity, which of course was undergirded by systemic oppression. But in terms of proximity, to be Southern and white meant that you did in fact interact, not on a level of equality, but nonetheless interacted and came in contact with black folks on a pretty regular basis. And as a result, could sort of unfortunately have this naive belief that, oh, we're friendly, everybody's friendly down here, we all get along great. In the North, the segregation was in many ways much more intense in the sense of real distance. You all living over here and we're living over here. Whereas in the South, it might have just been a railroad track or literally a road in the middle of town across which black folks lived and across which white folks lived. So the danger of the friendship argument, really, which so many people use to sort of get out of the conversation, is that in the South, we've always had those friendly relationships. We've always had those pleasantries and those intimacies, and some of them were even genuine. But underneath all that, right, was this much deeper systemic structure that I think is easily missed when we focus on the interpersonal as opposed to the institutional.
Okay, which really gets me to the last thing I wanted to touch on, which is some would say, some studies indicate that when you ask people about their individual prejudices when they come to race, that they are significantly less marked now than they were in past periods in the United States. Systemically speaking, we certainly don't have slavery anymore. We have the Civil Rights Act, but systemically there are still many racist infrastructures in this country. Right. Is it more likely that the systemic racism will decrease, although it is kind of trailing behind the decrease in individual racism, for lack of a better term? Or is that not something that is just going to kind of naturally go away as individual prejudices change?
I think that the danger is that systemic bias can be sustained without individual bias precisely because it's so much harder to notice when you're not the one being affected by it. I think the danger of the personal connection and maybe the reduction in personal hatred and bigotry is that it allows white folks to say, well, because whites generally don't have these horribly bigoted views anymore, at least we don't express them openly, that somehow the problem is gone. I think in some ways it was easier to see the systems when the bias was pretty openly expressed. So I'm not convinced that one will lead to the eradication of the other. And let's remember, even back in the early 60s, during the height of the civil rights movement, when overt racism was much more common, both at an individual level and obviously at the institutional level, the vast majority of white Americans, according to Gallup polls in 62 and 63, between 2/3 and 85% of white Americans said that they believed that racial minorities, the quote they used at the time, that racial minorities had equal opportunity and were treated equally. So white folks didn't see the systems even when they were blatant. And my fear is that we're having an even harder time seeing that now. So the personal connection, the reduction in personal bias to the extent that it's real, and I'm not altogether convinced that it's dropped as much as we think, is certainly good. But in a society where the polls say that as many as 6 out of 10 white Americans are still willing to admit that in general, they view black folks as less hardworking. And they say the only reason they're trailing whites is because they don't have the right work ethic. If white America, if 6 out of 10 are going to say that about the black community, that's a still racist belief. It may not be biological racism. It may not be saying these people are inherently inferior. But if you think that the condition of African Americans today, in terms of unemployment, poverty, schooling, et cetera, is because they lack the proper drive and determination, you're making a statement about this broad community that, in my opinion, makes it very unlikely that you're capable of treating any individual from that group fairly when they come into your place of employment or when they're a student in your classroom. So I'm not convinced the personal bias has gone away nearly as much as we think, and I'm very certain that historically institutional bias can be maintained regardless of the personal levels of bigotry.
We've been speaking with Tim Wise. He is an anti-racist educator and also author of 6 books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Tim, thanks so much for being on again with us.
You bet. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
If you have a Twitter or Facebook account, you can donate a Twitter retweet or Facebook share to the show by going to donateyouraccount.com/David Pakman Show. It costs nothing and takes mere seconds, and it really helps us get video clips out on the internet and so on. So please check it out, donateyouraccount.com/David Pakman Show. We've talked about Texas and the problem that's going on in Texas with Texas textbooks, that they are being revised and reauthored and modified, often with conservative religious influence. And the reason that this can happen is that because Texas altogether represents such a large market for school textbooks, many times publishers will work with Texas because they wouldn't want to lose Texas as a client. And then whatever kind of curriculum is ultimately included in the book is then offered to all of the other states. So this is the background for why Texas is so important in this, essentially a battle over what children should be taught. The Texas Freedom Network, which is an educational watchdog group, recently commissioned a group of history scholars to look at the new social studies textbook. Okay, so this is just one analysis of a new social studies textbook that is going to be used. And Kathy Miller, who's president of the group, said that publishers apparently tried their best, but that there are glaringly disturbing issues in this new social studies textbook. Here's a quote. "In all fairness, it's clear that the publishers struggled with these flawed standards and still managed to do a good job in some areas. On the other hand, a number of textbook passages essentially reflect the ideological beliefs of politicians on the state board rather than sound scholarship and factual history." Here's a list of some of the problems with the new Texas Social Studies book. The new Texas Social Studies book downplays segregation as if it wasn't really that bad. The new book contains cartoons depicting outer space aliens when explaining affirmative action, to imply that those who benefit from affirmative action are less American or really less human in some way. That is literally the analogy that is being made by the book. The issue of taxes is discussed as if taxes are flat out a bad thing. Never is the fact that taxes pay for things like Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, roads, police. That's not mentioned in the new social studies textbook, just that taxes are portrayed in a negative light. The new social studies book suggests that democracy was inspired by the Old Testament, by Moses, and by the Ten Commandments, ignoring the secular origins, the secular history, the secular examples of democracy amongst human society. The social studies book implies that Muslims are inherently violent, but that Christians have never been. It doesn't talk at all about Christian violence. And it also suggests that scientists simply disagree about climate change and global warming. Typical strategy, pretend that there is a big disagreement, a big controversy. And it also implies that it will eventually be an issue that sorts itself out. They've really done an amazing job in Texas, huh? Haven't they? I recommended, or maybe I didn't recommend, I recently watched this documentary, which is on Netflix and elsewhere online, called The Revisionaries, which is a kind of behind-the-scenes look at the discussions and controversy and the process by which Texas textbooks are being revised. It's called The Revisionaries. I highly encourage you to check it out. It is despicable what is becoming the official curriculum for children in Texas schools. Absolutely sickening. The new Washington Post ABC News poll about the Affordable Care Act finds that even in the states where Mitt Romney won the presidential election, there is still slightly more support for keeping Obamacare than for repealing it. The poll's general finding, the broad finding, is that 57% of voters support Obamacare or don't support it but want to allow it to continue to see how it does. Only 39% want to repeal the law. That's 57 to 39 nationally for keeping Obamacare over repealing. It's insane, by the way, that 39% want to repeal it, but let's skip that for a second. It turns out, though, that when we look at the state-by-state results, there is not a substantial difference on the question when you compare voters from blue states to voters from red states. There are a lot more anti-Obamacare ads in the red states, but even in spite of that, there is only slightly more opposition to Obamacare in red states than there is in blue states. So this is interesting on a number of levels. Number one, it's interesting because in spite of the fact that many Republican governors are keeping the Medicaid expansion out of their states, in spite of the fact that the red states are often getting bombarded with anti-Obamacare messaging, we still see pretty steady levels of support for Obamacare in the blue states than we do in the red states. It's also interesting because when we look at the provisions of the Affordable Care Act, when individuals are fairly and honestly polled about the individual provisions, we see that there is almost complete consensus nationwide. Should the government provide some basic level of care to all Americans, regardless of ability to pay? People say yes. Now, when you say, do you think that the government should take over health care from private industry, you get a very different answer. But when we fairly ask people about these things, there actually is a consensus that not only supports what's in Obamacare, it supports a move towards national health care. So this is encouraging to some extent, particularly in the sense that it seems that the red states are somehow able to resist the barrage, the influence from that barrage of anti-Obamacare ads. And I don't know, I'm still completely skeptical and not at all optimistic about the possibility of this country moving in the direction of national health care. But I am encouraged by the fact that this poll and the other polls which ask about specific provisions at least are pointing us in the direction that people do deep down know what it is they want and what's right when it comes to health care, even if they're swayed by the language, the wordsmithing, and the politics of it. We have a voicemail number. It is 219-2-DAVID-P. You can call the voicemail number any time of day. Here's an interesting comment related to the lawsuit against President Obama and the obsession with President Obama's tan suit a little while back. Check this out.
Hey, guys. I figured I'd just say that conservatives are just upset because people are paying more attention to Obama's suit than to John Boehner's suit against Obama. That's all I got for you now. Keep doing what you're doing. Thanks.
Yeah, it's some kind of suit confusion, I guess we could say. Good point. Very funny. Here's one more voicemail we got. Again, the number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Take a listen.
Hi, this is David Lawless from Anderson, South Carolina. I'd just like to say that the guy who does the Hatriot Mail intro and reading is hilarious. I don't know if you've given him a shout out before, but I missed it. So if you would just, do that on future show. I mean, I love the way that guy reads this stuff.
No, it's great. We haven't given him a shout out because he does have like a day job doing voiceover work, and he is asked to remain anonymous when it comes to Hatriot Mail. On today's bonus show, I will address the issue which I'm sure is in your mind now of where is Lewis today? Why was Lewis not on the program today? I will give you the update on the David Pakman Show 2015 Hatriot Mail calendar. We will talk about some changes coming to the member benefits, and also we will talk about some of the behind the scenes and what's been going on with recent interviews, the longer interviews, the different interviews. So we have an excellent bonus show planned for you today. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up for membership. Support the work we're doing. If you like what we're doing, fund it, because that's how we're going to remain on the air. davidpakman.com/membership. We'll talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.